A number of explanations have been offered for the large lifespans in the pre-flood genealogy in Genesis 5. Gordon Wenham, in his Word Biblical Commentary on Genesis called Barnouin's Theory, the bravest attempt to explain the precise lifespans of the antediluvians, that is, the people before the flood. As simply as I can put it, Barnouin believed the lifespans had numerical correspondence to astronomical periods. The most obvious of these would be Enoch, who is the seventh in the list in Genesis 5, who lived to be 365, which obviously brings to mind a solar year. Kenan was 910, which is 91 times 10, 91 being the quarter of a solar year. Also important to his thesis were Synodic Periods.
Now, what is the Synodic period really referring to? Well, from this top-down perspective, what the Synodic period is referring to is, let's just pause it right there, it's when these two planets line up with each other and the sun. So you see they're kind of lined up with one another right now. You can almost think it like two hands on a clock. When those clock hands line up with each other, that's when we start the clock. In fact, there's actually a clock on here, so I'll zero the counter. Okay, and that's when the period starts. And let me play it. And a synodic period is then when those two planets line up with each other again. So right here, right about there.
And so specifically here, we're dealing with the 5 known planets to the ancients. In the case of Venus, for example, it takes 584 days to complete the circuit. So it appears at one point in the sky, 584 days later, it's going to reach that same point in the sky again. Saturn takes 378 days, for example. Now, if you take those two planets' days and add them up, you get 962, which is Jared's lifespan. So all of this is interesting, but that's about the extent of the information I've been able to find. And it all seems to come from Gordon Wenham's short interaction with Barnouin's article, meaning subsequent discussion is not from Barnouin's actual article, but from Wenham's discussion of the article. And information about Barnouin and the article are really difficult to come by. In fact, I don't even know Barnouin's first name. The obscurity of the article probably has to do with the fact that it was originally published in a French journal in 1970. So interacting with it would mean tracking down a 50-year-old French journal article and then translating it. And so I finally became frustrated enough that I did this myself. I'm not French, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a theologian, but I'm just going to do my best here and kind of work through the article. Now, a quick sidebar, though, before I jump into it. I'm going to discuss the numbers in a nuts and bolts kind of approach, meaning I'm assuming the numbers are symbolic and thus artificial. This says nothing of the historicity of the people or even the possibility of the long ages of the antediluvians. If people like Ray Kurzweil and Elon Musk can talk about immortality through technology, I find it odd to limit God in that discussion. A being who can speak a universe into existence, I think, can keep people alive as long as he wants to. So that doesn't really bother me. But I do think that the numbers were chosen for a specific symbolic value, and namely their astronomical significance. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump in. Now, the first couple of pages of the article, I can actually skip through. I'm not really going to do much with just because, for the sake of time. But really what he's doing is he's establishing the connection between the Sumerian Kings List or the Babylonian Kings List and Genesis 5, the genealogy found there. If you're unfamiliar, the first 11 chapters, specifically of Genesis, have a number of touch points with Babylonian material. I'm specifically thinking here of the Apkallu, Genesis 6, the sons of God, and they have their own flood story, things like that. So you have something of a theological corrective of Babylonian theology going on specifically in those first 11 chapters. Other religions are hit as well, but especially Babylon receives special attention in these early chapters. In fact, chapter 11 culminates with the Tower of Babel, which is the same word for Babylon. Everywhere else in the Bible, Babel is translated as Babylon. So the Tower of Babel is the Tower of Babylon. So this really shouldn't surprise us that we may be seeing a touch point here with the King's List and the pre-flood people. In fact, that's where the King's List comes from. It's the first 10 people, and then you have the hero of the flood. And of course, in the biblical account, we have 9 names, and then Noah is the 10th. And of course, Noah is the hero of the flood. Now, like I said, I'm mostly going to skip through this. I do want to note here, though, that there is a little bit of discussion concerning the Babylonian list, that there may be 8 or 9 names, depending on how you look at this or depending on the particular tablet you're dealing with. That becomes kind of important because Enoch is kind of the odd duck. And so you have 9 names and then Noah. But in some instance, you may want to take Enoch out of the equation, and then you would have 8. So the fact that in some Babylonian witnesses you actually have 8 names instead of 9 maybe is another one of these correspondences. So that's just worth noting. But let's just continue scrubbing through, and we'll just go ahead and hit this chart, and this is just really where we'll pick up. Barnouin is going to point out here that these numbers seem to be obviously built on the sexagesimal system of numeration. If you're unfamiliar, the sexagesimal system is a base of 60 instead of ours, which is a base of 10. But we still maintain the 60 base number on or with clocks, right? So we have the 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, because it's easy to divide that into a circle. So 360 degrees, that's why we still maintain it. But anyway, it's based on this 60. Now, as we start getting to examples, it'll become more obvious, even if you still don't fully understand how a 60 base system would work. Now, he's going to point out here, and these are basically King's List different, to use the biblical nomenclature, text traditions or whatever. But you have one exception in this one, and you have 2 exceptions in this other one. All the reign links are multiples of 3,600, which is the square of 60. That is 60 times 60. And so as you look here, you see how neatly everything works, specifically with that base of 60. Over here, you have the biblical tradition, right? So you have the LXX, which is the Greek tradition, and the number is 7,601. The Samaritan Pentateuch is 7,137. The Masoretic text, this is the ages of all the patriarchs added together. You get 7,625, and he gives you how you would get to that. 127 times 60 plus 5. This one's the most notable. 121 times 60 plus 365 gives us our total there. So you have both the base of 60 as well as the solar year embedded in this number of all the patriarchs added together. And we'll look at this again in kind of a chart form. So again, if this isn't perfectly clear yet, it'll start becoming clear as we continue to move forward. And I just want to note here that, again, he has this statement that's appropriate in Genesis 5 to admit the hypothesis that the third series must sometimes be considered without the number 365, therefore without Enoch. We have already seen that it is perhaps necessary, starting from the Babylonian model, to be limited to 8 antediluvian characters. So the point is, sometimes Enoch is the odd duck, and if it kind of works in relation to the Sumerian kings listed, maybe take out Enoch altogether. So sometimes it's added, sometimes it's not. And I like this statement here by this other scholar regarding the Babylonian list. He says, one cannot escape the impression that the various calculations began with the sum total before distributing the details among various kingdoms. In other words, it looks like they had a end total in mind, and then they reverse engineered the numbers from there. They kind of divvied up the numbers among the various reigns to make it make sense, but they had an end goal in mind. So continuing on, we can actually skip most of this up until this chart. Now, this chart is going to become very important as we move forward. So we're going to want to have a very good grasp of what's going on in this chart. So this first series of numbers here is the age. It's not actually explicitly the age of the patriarch with their firstborn, because Seth is not the firstborn of Adam, but it's the age when the next person in the line is going to is born, right? So Adam was 130 when he had Seth. Seth was 105 when he had Enosh. Enosh was 90. He had Kenan. That's the first series. The second series is their lifespan after that point. And then you add those two together and you get the third series of numbers, which is their total lifespans. Adam was 930, Seth was 912, so on and so forth. Now, what's next to this is not actually found in the biblical text, but it is implicitly there if you assume the sexagesimal system. So how we read this chart is there's this little subscript S here, which stands for 60. So Adam, for example, is 2 60s, that is 120 plus 10 equals 130. Let's do a simpler one. Kenan was 70, so that's a 60 plus 10, 70. So that's how you read this chart, right? So it's how many 60s and what the remainder is. This is important because interesting things will happen with these numbers as we move forward. But again, this is not explicitly found in the biblical text. You're not going to find these numbers exactly like 10, 45, 30, 10. You're not going to find that series of numbers, but it's implicitly there if you assume the sexagesimal numbering. So we're just going to plop in right here in this paragraph. So he's pointing out how that he has a separation after the fourth patriarch, and he's saying it's justified especially by the third series. So if you look at the first four numbers, and especially in that last series, you notice we have a nice symmetry there of 15 60s. And of course, when you add those up, you end up with 60 60s. Especially interesting is the remainders that are left over, which are 30, 12, 5, and 10 equal 57. That's interesting because following this break, we have another series of 57s. At the very bottom, we have Lamech's 57, and we have Mahalalel and Jared are 55 plus 2 equals 57. So in this list, the remainder, we end up with three different 57s. Of course, 57 is 3 digits short of 60. And of course, we have three 57s, so we're 9 digits short of 60, of 3 60s. But we do have 9 digits left over in the age of Methuselah. So if we add his number to those 57s, we end up with 3 different 60s. And then we have the odd duck of Enoch, his 5 additional units, which are there, as Barnouin says, probably from other symbolic reasons he's there. But again, remember, sometimes Enoch is going to fall in and out of the numbers, just because of the oddity of his number. Another interesting thing is if we look at the remainders in the first series of numbers, they form this kind of chiastic thing where we end up with 156 total, but we end up with a triple 52. So we add these across and we get 52 in these different columns, but they form kind of this chiastic thing going on. 52, of course, is the number of weeks in the solar year. Now, he's going to go on to point out the difficulty of dividing a 365-day year because it's only divisible by 5. 366, obviously one day up, would be divisible by 2 and 3, but most interesting is 364. So a solar year minus 1 day is divisible by 2, 4, and 7. So the division by 4 would give you 91 days. A division by 7 gives you 52 weeks. But 7, of course, is also the best way to split into a quarter, 29.5 days of a lunar month. So there's some flexibility there if you go with a solar year minus 1 day. But back to the sexagesimal stuff with these series of numbers here. Again, just looking at the first 4 names, in looking at them in a series, the first and second series, again, they also form a somewhat chiastic thing where you have in a row, you end up with 90, which is 3 times 30. Another row, you end up with 87, which is 3 times 29. Of course, that equals 177. And as is going to point out here, the total of the remainders in sexagesimal numeration for the first 4 numbers of the first 2 series is the number of days corresponding to 6 successive lunar months, 3 of 29 days and 3 of 30. In other words, 177 is half of a lunar year. And again, back to the top 4 in the third series. Remember, we had the 60/60s, which is 3,600. And if you add the total units remaining, 57, you end up with 3,657. But if you just look at the number, look at the first 3 numbers, that's 365. That is 3,657 is 10 solar years plus 7 days. So again, is that a coincidence? That seems odd if that is a coincidence. As if that wasn't enough math for you, we're going to go even deeper here. What you have to understand here is he's starting off noting the difference between the solar year and the lunar year. So the difference between 365 and 354. And it's 11 days. And he actually gives you the specific number because it's not a full day. There's a remainder left over. The difference is 11 days. That is going to account because down here we're going to have this equation, and you might wonder, where are these numbers coming from? It's coming from this, right? So the 11 difference, the day difference between the solar and the lunar year, and also the fact that the solar and the lunar year each exceed by 2 days, if you will, a multiple of 11. So in the case, let's just look at right here. In the case of a year, of a solar year, it's 33 times 11 plus 2. So 33 times 11 is 363. So plus 2 more days, you get a solar year. A lunar year is 32 times 11 plus 2. After 3 years, the difference of 11 gives 33. So then we can write it this way. So after 3 years, or 3 solar years, is 33 times 33 plus 6. And again, the 6 coming from those additional, the 2-day difference. And again, 3 lunar years, 32 times 33 plus 6, gives you 1,056 plus 6. Now, as is going to point out, the more precise calculation, the nearest whole integer is actually 7. So you really could say all of these numbers plus 7. So the parallelism indicated above remains valid. Now the number 32 times 33 equals 1056 is none other than the total of the 9 numbers of the first series of Genesis 5, while the totals of the other 2 series are this. So he gives you the equation of how to get to the other numbers. So again, we're back to the series of numbers in our list here in Genesis 5. The first list being this equation that he gave above, and then he gives the other equations how you would get the rest of them, where it's 6 times 33 squared plus 33 plus 2 is the second series of numbers. The last, which would be all of the ages of the lifespans of the patriarchs, are 7 times 33 squared plus 2. And here he's going to talk about the difficulties of the lunar solar cycles and all of that this is a well-known and very ancient problem. I do want to point out one thing in the footnote because it is interesting, that he points out that the first and third would therefore, he's talking about the series of the columns in our chart here, would be linked to 33 that should be squared and 32 times 33. And he also notes this, which is interesting, that there are several numbers that of the form number times number plus 1 that appear in Genesis 5. So the last number of the first series, this is Lamech's age when he had Noah, is 13 times 14, or the number of days that form 26 weeks, half a year. The first number of the third series, this is Adam's total lifespan, is 30 times 31, where one would be attempted to see the durations of our months, dividing the solar year into 12 equal parts as much as possible. He also notes here that 65 is 32 plus 33, and 30 plus 31 is 61. But this 65 here is going to become relevant later, because you're going to find 65 all over the place. And this is just one way in which you could get that number, is 32 plus 33. So continuing on. Now this is where we're going to now hit the synodic periods. Again, how long it takes for an object in the sky to reach that same point. This all looks really complex, but we're just going to focus on the last column in the bottom. And here he's going to put it into a nice little chart. Now, one thing should immediately jump out at us if we look through all these numbers. I realize there's a lot, so these numbers might not exactly jump out, but if we looked at it long enough, we would notice, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that 777 is Lamech's number, and we find that right here with Jupiter. And who would that be? 378 would be Saturn. So Jupiter and Saturn, you get Lamech's number. And you get 962 there at the top with Venus and Saturn. And then he also notes here that you have Mahalalel, who's 895. Of course, that's one digit off of what we have here with Mercury and Mars. So now there's still a lot more to go through, though. He's going to point out that the only synodic period that's a multiple of 60 is Mars. And here the number 780, that's the period of Mars, is divisible by 12, and the quotient is 65. It is going to point out that it's difficult to find astronomical significance of 65 and even 60 and 59. They're not super astronomically relevant per se. So point is, we don't have a lot of astronomical significance for 65, other than the fact that it is related. If you multiply it by 12, you get Mars' number. But 65 does pop up in our ages in other ways, right? So 300 plus our 65 gives us Enoch's numbers. Also, we get the same number, 65, in Mahalalel's number. The double, which is 130, is the number of Adam. The triple of the number, 195, is the sum of Seth and Enosh. So there you have a lot of the numbers have some relation to the number 65 or its multiple. And he says this is probably systematic. In any case, we will find 65 when the number 455 appears, which is 7 times 65, therefore 7/12 of 68. I'm going to highlight this because this is going to become important, so keep that in mind. Now we're going to work our way down to this chart here, and the total of all the synodic periods together is 2,257. And it just so happens that Adam, Jared, and Enoch added together give you 2,257. Seth, Enosh, and Mahalalel added together is all the synodic periods plus 455. Remember, I told you to take note of that number above. And Kenan, Methuselah, and Lamech together give you all the synodic periods plus an additional Jupiter, which is 399. Now, it's more than just that, though, because down here he gives you the sexagesimal numeration in the bottom part of this. And some interesting things really happen when you do this. First off, we should note that all of this, the 2,257, is actually 37 60s plus 37 remainder, right? So it's, if you multiply the 37 times 60 plus 37, you get this number. Now, what's interesting, though, if you triple that with the 3 different sets of the patriarchs, you're going to end up with 111 60s plus 111 remaining. But what's also interesting is the additional leftover that you have to account for. In this case, 455 and 399, when put into sexagesimal numeration, give you 14 60s and 14 remainder. Meaning that this grand total of 7,625 of the third series of the numbers of Genesis 5 is equal to 125 60s and 125 remainder, and therefore also divisible by 61. So we have 7,625 is equal to 125 times 61. From the point of view of the calendar, we immediately think 61 is the number of days of 2 successive solar months, 30 and 31 days, as 59 for 2 lunar months, 29, 30. But he's going to ask, is this what the biblical authors were thinking? Perhaps more simply, they are interested in a theoretical division of a year into 6 or 12 equal parts. However, with 365, this is not possible. The best solution is to take 366, which is 6 times 61. And we have 7,625 equals 21 times 366 minus 61, or 21 times 365 minus 40 days. Perhaps we should not pay too much attention here to this yet so biblical duration of 40 days, nor consequently to the exact value of 21 times 365. But in other words, this number that we keep coming across is 21, basically 21 solar years minus 40 days is all the patriarchs added together. We have additional charts that is given below in additional equations that could also account for how we get to these numbers, specifically how we can get to the 455 and where the 399 comes from, and how the symmetry of these things work together. But it requires a lot more math. You have to pull out the calculator and for you to see kind of the connections. Now, I think just superficially, I think a lot of this, to me at least, is persuasive. There's too many of these things for it to be a coincidence. Sure, I'm sure there are some parts that are coincidental, but you just have too much that ends up having these calendrical implications that I think that they did have certain astronomical numbers in mind, and that they operated in a way to maximize the amount of astronomical numbers that they could get to pop out. And so they move around the numbers a bit. Like a good example of this is you would not get this precise equation here with the 125 60s and 125 remainder. You're not going to get quite that level of symmetry if, for instance, you have exactly if Mahalalel is 896 instead of his normal 895. Of course, 896 is the period of Mercury and Mars. His number, of course, is 895. But if they had done the 896, well, then you have to move other things around. They may not have wanted to do that. But his number gets close, like really close. It's one digit off. And so I think things like that give it that plausibility in my mind that they had to make compromises in some places, and in that case they weren't willing to mess with the overall structure. In Wyndham's commentary, he points out the numbers are impressive and whatnot, but there really isn't a theological reason. Barnouin really doesn't offer that and suggest that, and frankly he really doesn't. I can read you kind of the end of his article here, and he's just having general observations about it may have seemed useful to number the long years plus life of the patriarchs of humanity, to borrow from the science of that time in a numerical set taken from the domain of the measurement of time. So basically, it's just this general idea of creation or whatever. However, I do think that you could take this idea much further, and there's a number of places you could go with it. One is Genesis 15, right? So the idea, the seed promise given to Abraham. He says that they would be as many as the sand on the shore, and then he says they would be like the stars. And even in the ancient world, this was wondered about, because the question was, is it qualitative or quantitative? In other words, would they be like the stars in essence or like the stars in number? And most people just assume he means number. However, many of the ancients, and I would say actually the biblical authors as well, especially in places like 1 Corinthians 15, the idea is actually qualitative, because everywhere in the ancient world, stars were associated with divinity, with divine beings, that kind of idea. And this idea is everywhere. It's in the Old Testament. This, like in Daniel, those who bring many to righteousness will shine like the stars above. So you have this connection between divinity and astral symbolism, basically, put it that way. And so there is this connection of the people of God with the stars in the sky, like the heavenly host, for instance. And Barnouin actually has a different article in the Book of Numbers talking about the census numbers and how they themselves have astronomical underpinnings as well. And so he's arguing essentially for how you have the heavenly hosts, which are the stars. You have an earthly host, which mirror the stars in some of the numerological sets in the Book of Numbers. And so this would be another one of those ideas. I think part of the reason why a lot of people see this idea of using this kind of stuff as just so foreign and weird, because we in the West have really lost this idea of theosis, of becoming divine, becoming like God. Maybe because people feel it's too close to Mormonism or something like that. I'm not really sure. But I think that from that lens, from that perspective, it actually would make sense to connect the people of God to the visible stars, to planets, to the heavenly bodies. Again, just as God has that heavenly host, we become like them in a significant way. And this is just a very veiled way of communicating that kind of idea concerning the people of God before the flood.